Like they I think they act like they hate me, but they really love me.
All right, here we go.
That's definitely wrong.
This St. George definitely loves me.
No, she really does, though.
So this is the crowding out effect, or as also as I call it, you versus Shaquille O'Neal. So here we go. Just to kind of give you, some of you may not know who Shaquille O'Neal is, or you may not be able to picture in your mind.
Is he the guy in the Gold Bond commercials that does?
Yeah,
I know
that is.
That's very curious, isn't it?
Maybe, but he isn't a Gold Bond commercial, or he's an Icy Hot.
Icy Hot. That's what it is.
All right.
Shaq is stooped so low that he did commercials on show. It's like, that's
Are you ready?
All right, so moving on.
No, I would beat Shaq in one-on-one.
So that we can do this. So that's Shaquille O'Neal. The guy in the red is about my size. He's actually a little bit taller than me. I couldn't really find a picture that shows the immense size of Shaquille O'Neal. He is a massive human being. He's 7'1". His shoe size is 22.
What?
And he weighs, according to, again, this is according to Wikipedia, he weighs 325 pounds. He is a big dude. Shaquille O'Neal is a big guy. He's beefy, but I wouldn't call him fat by any stretch. So, with that being said, hold on. With that being said, okay, so he's a foot taller than I am. So imagine trying to get a rebound, trying to make a rebound against Shaquille O'Neal. It's not going to happen. The crowding out effect in the loanable funds market acts as the same way. So you redraw your loanable funds graph. Quantity loanable funds on your X, real interest rate on the Y, and upward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. When we talked about that, because as interest rates get higher, more people save, which is where loanable funds come from. And then as interest rates get lower, more people want those loans. And so hence the reason why demand's downward sloping, supply's upward sloping. And so this is, again, the crowding out effect of that. Now, loanable funds is kind of weird in that there are situations where we can move both the supply and the demand line. So we're going to run through the same thing, but we're going to do it first with demand and then quickly with supply. So when the government needs to finance itself, now on the AP test, they're going to phrase questions that deal with the crowding out effect in one of a few ways. The most common that I've seen is that the government, it'll say the US government, or they've stopped using that because it's a big joke now, or they'll say like the government of this country or whatever has either a budget surplus or is it a balanced budget. That's how they always start questions that usually lead to this. Okay, so assume that this country A has a balanced budget. And then it's going to go through the scenarios. So usually the first part is going to be an ag demand, ag supply question, where it's either going to tell you to draw it longer in equilibrium, or it's going to say we're experiencing a recession or something like that. You're going to have to draw it. Then it's going to ask you for a monetary or a fiscal fix to it. So if it's a monetary fix to it, and the AD is in a recessionary gap, or the country's in a recessionary gap, it says, what's a monetary fix to it? You're going to say the Fed should, somebody whispered it correctly,
Buy bonds.
buy bonds. Good. They should buy bonds. Okay? Excellent. Good job. You've got that point. So, but the government either to buy bonds or a fiscal solution, if they are in a balanced budget arrangement, they are going to have to go into debt in order to do that, right? In order to buy bonds, the federal government doesn't have money in the money supply or the monetary base. Instead, it needs to print new money and then use that money to buy the bonds. So it's essentially, it's funding itself using debt, and that's exactly what's going to happen. So either through buying bonds, or it's going to say, or a fiscal solution, one of two fiscal solutions, one of them would be what? If they're in a recessionary gap. Okay, cut taxes or to increase government spending. Either way, that's going to drive them into debt. That's why they always say they started a balanced budget. So when that happens, the government has to borrow money. Remember, they don't just simply dump money out of helicopters. Instead, they're buying bonds, or they're increasing government spending by printing money and then using that. So in doing that, in order to essentially sell debt, okay, the government needs to take out a loan. The only place the government really can do that is in the financial sector. And so the government's financing this through debt. Okay, they're going to then put pressure on banks to essentially loan them money. Okay, remember, their excess reserves, when it boils right down to it, the reserve ratio, that has to already be done, and then you have a situation where they could hold on to some excess reserves. They're either going to loan it out or buy bonds with it. All right, so that means make a loan to private citizens and businesses, or by buying bonds, they're essentially funding the government. Okay, so the government then puts pressure on the loanable funds market because remember, loanable funds comes from excess reserves. They're just simply loaning it. So that means that there's going to be less excess reserves or less loanable funds. So one of two ways you could go about thinking about this. Either the government increases the demand for loanable funds. Okay, they increase the demand for loanable funds. So that raises the interest rates. So when government does that, in order to either make it so that it's more attractive for banks to buy government debt, or in order to get people to save enough money in order to finance government debt, interest rates will rise and people will begin to save more, so you can see the quantity of loanable funds increasing. That's one way to attack this, is a demand side thing, where the demand for loanable funds increases because the government wants that loan, and they do so by financing it through debt. Okay, everybody good with that so far? You're following? Okay, the government is a massive entity. The government is Shaquille O'Neal. Okay, you are this scrawny white guy trying to guard Shaquille O'Neal. Not going to happen. You are trying to get a rebound against Shaquille O'Neal. He blocks you out, or he crowds you out. The government's no different. The government is Shaq. It's 7'1", 325 pounds of pure, not you. Okay? The government in and of itself, the most profit, or I'm sorry, the company that's worth the most, the highest in value, it sometimes fluctuates between Apple and Exxon. Exxon being an oil and gas company. So sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. Let's assume it's Apple. Apple has roughly about $1 trillion in assets. Okay, not bad, right? And we're talking about both things that are solvent, things that are liquid from naked money. So it's got $1 trillion in assets that are at least solvent. So, not bad. So if the government went to Apple and said, we're just going to take all your stuff and sell it, and they get $1 trillion for it, that'll fund the government a third of the year. 1/3 of the year. That's it. And then if they went to all the rich people in the United States and were like, it's mine now, yoink, that could essentially run the government for just over half the year. The government is massive. Okay, you're talking about $3.5 trillion of spending, if not more sometimes, that the government does in a year. The government is Shaquille O'Neal. Apple, in all of its wealth, only makes up a tiny small part of what the government spending is. Okay? The national debt, we're going to watch IOUSA on Monday. The national debt, when IOUSA was made, and that was in 2008, they're like, it's catastrophic. It's going to end the United States. It's at $8 trillion. The debt right now is $20 trillion. So in less than 10 years, $12 trillion have been added to the debt. Okay, that should be scary. And they're already sounding the alarm with $8 trillion. So we've talked about this in AP Gov, but if you want to get rid of the debt, okay, you have to deal with Social Security. Sorry, Grandma and Grandpa, you can't live at your house anymore. Right? We'll take that. That's what Social Security funds. You can cut Medicaid. Okay, sorry, poor people, it looks like you're dead because you're not paying for your health care anymore or anything like that. Or Medicare. Sorry, Grandma and Grandpa, you know that prescription that costs you about $300 that the government pays for? No more high blood pressure time for your grandpa. And then, right? So, those are the three things you can cut. As you can imagine, or you've got to raise taxes. Raising taxes is a good way to never get elected again. You can say, sorry old people, you can imagine what the ads would be for that. Or the biggest block of voting people are grandma and grandpa. They're not going to vote you back into office. So if you cut everything else out of the budget, absolutely everything else, military, you cut schools, you cut roads, you cut everything else the federal government does, except for Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and then the debt, the interest on the debt, because they have to pay that interest off, because that's agreed upon. If you cut everything else and only kept those four things, you'd already start in deficit. Now add the military and everything else, schools and everything else that the government does, you can see where the debt goes to. So that's what you guys get to deal with. Have fun with that. Because at some point there's going to be austerity measures that either you're going to say, sorry, Social Security is just not available anymore, or you're going to have to do something like that, and raise taxes on top of it too. So you can imagine that's not a very popular thing to be doing. But it's going to be your generation is going to be stuck with having to deal with. So the whole moral of that entire story is to draw us back to how large the government is. The government, in borrowing money, crowds out private investing. Because the demand curve shifts to the right, it is such a massive entity that smaller investors, even like I said, a company as massive as Apple, cannot compete with the amount of government debt. It can't compete with the government for debt. One, because the government is so massive, and two, because the government, even with $20 trillion of debt, is still the safest place to keep money or to loan out money. Because the government will do everything in its power not to default on its debt, because we've already talked about that. If I loan you $100 and you come back to me and we agree in a week you're going to pay me back, and there's no $100, it's like 3 months' salary for me, so I don't have that. And you come back to me and you say, sorry bro, I can't pay you back, the chances of me loaning you money ever again is 0. And that's the same when governments do it too. Okay, people won't then invest in that country, or the country won't be able to service its own debt. So the government is still a safe place. And if worse comes to worse, the government can do what you and I can't. Print its own money. It can print its way out. It's inflationary, it'd be stupid, it'd be really, really horrible for the economy. But it's either default on the loan and print your way out of the debt, they're going to print their way out of the debt. So it puts tremendous pressure as far as this demand side on loanable funds. Banks are more willing to give them money because they're a safe bet, and also they need a lot of it, and so banks, they then crowd out, or Shaquille O'Neal box out. Don't put that on the AP test. Unless I get it, then it'll make me laugh. But they will crowd out private investors. That's on the demand side. On the supply side of things, remember, where do excess reserves go? Loanable funds. All right, meaning that your savings, okay, the savings, the supply of loanable funds, the thing that makes up the supply side of loanable funds, which are savings, those then get dwindled down because the banks are giving the government that debt, so it will dwindle down the supply of loanable funds. So supply shifts to the left as well. Now the thing is, it depends on how high interest rates are, depending on what happens to the quantity, the x-axis of loanable funds, but interest rates will continue to increase. Here's something that I forgot to tell the other class that you guys need to star and circle. Interest rates and the price of bonds are inversely related. Interest rates and the price of bonds are inversely related. Meaning that as interest rates go up, the price of bonds actually goes down. Because they're trying to get people to buy these bonds. And if the interest rates continue to climb, they've got to drop the price of the bonds in order to get people to buy. So they're inversely related. So you need to make sure you know that. That's a question that they love asking on the AP exam, especially in the last like 2 or 3 years, that always, for whatever reason, always shows up. The inverse relationship between bond prices and interest rates. We'll get into that a little bit more often, or a little bit more later, but I want to make sure I told you guys that now while I was thinking about it. Yeah.
So the crowding effect is that basically the
bank loans all their money to the government because they're so much more secure than like. any
That's one
person.
reason why, yeah. And two, because, well, that's probably their motivation to loan
Okay.
money to the government, because they're so much more secure. Like, I'm refinancing my house, I told you guys, and it's like a part-time job to prove to them that I'm a safe investment. Even though I've never defaulted on any loan, my credit rating is excellent, I've never been late on a payment, but still, they want to make sure I'm a safe investment. They don't ask that of the government, because like I said, in the end, the government could always print its way out. Something I can't do.
So.
I mean, I tried to give my mortgage company fake money, they didn't take it. I know, bunch of creeps.
So like, the reason that they loan is because the government won't default on its loans?
That's one of the, probably the biggest motivation, yeah. And again, it's a safe place to store that debt. And also, right, the government can do, again, something that I can't do. I can't just make my house worth some, like, more than it actually is. But the government can set prices on bonds, it can set interest rates, it can manipulate it so that,
It'll fix it.
yeah. So, again, Shaquille O'Neal, the government's so massive, it will crowd out private investing. That's what the crowding out effect is. If you get asked that on the test, you can manipulate either one. If the demand side makes more sense to you, you're like, of course, the government is demanding more loanable funds, and you shift the demand, good. They'll take that, the readers will take that. And again, I'm trying to think, there's probably ways that we'll come up with at the practice FRQs, where you'll see the College Board is trying to get you to manipulate one side or the other. But in the end, it's been my experience as a reader that if you're showing you understand a concept, even if College Board is trying to get you to a certain place, if you show you understand the concept, they're going to give you the points. Or if this makes sense, that the supply of loanable funds comes from excess reserves, there aren't as many excess reserves available because they're now buying bonds, the banks are buying bonds, and that shifts the supply left. If that makes the most sense to you, perfect. Stick with that, do this on the test if it asks about the crowding out. Either one works just fine. Either one, like I said, the graders will take, unless there's a situation where it specifically forces you into the demand or supply side. I don't remember ever seeing that, but you know, we'll keep our eye out for it when we're doing practice FRQs. Yeah.
So a good question, when there's inflation, like 3% inflation,
Yeah.